something that you'll take to heart. This was one of the inspirations that got me started into actual research again, into this new direction. Again, the idea of nitrogen fixation that I really maintain. I still am fixated on nitrogen myself. And this is actually, you can't, if some of you might be able to read it, Zuyini is the Chinese milk vetch. It's the traditional green manure of China, and it's responsible, or at least I believed at that time, is responsible for the long-sustained productivity of rice paddy agriculture in this region, the Tai Lake region of China. This was interesting, and even at this time, this was very unusual. Animal traction. This is one of the poorest areas of China where this was held, in Anhui province, where they were still using green manures as their primary source of nitrogen for the rice paddy. That's why we held the conference there. And the Chinese had still had a very large breeding commitment and a technical commitment to extending and developing green manures as an important part of the farming system, something that the US had abandoned decades before and was really only taken up by people like Robert Rodale. Okay, the USDA had very little to say about that at that time. And I was inspired by that. That they were really still trying to maintain a natural source of nitrogen supply to the ecosystems. And I think if you've learned a little bit about terrestrial ecology, one of the first things you learn is that terrestrial ecosystems tend to have primary productivity limited by nitrogen. Nitrogen is the most common limiting nutrient anywhere in the world on land. And so the question is, if you're going to maintain high productivity over centuries or thousands of years, which I think is ultimately the goal of all agriculture, do you need to subsidize a system with artificially synthesized nitrogen as we do? Or is it possible to do this over the long term using natural sources of nitrogen fixation, like in green manures, like Chinese milk vetch, or recycling of nitrogen or conservation? What are the properties of a long sustained agroecosystem in terms of nitrogen? What do they do? And then there's another thing that actually got me into more trouble later. We'll talk about that a little later. But nitrogen being potentially a limiting factor to human population. So I guess all of you, now if you're Chinese, you don't get to call out here. All of you can identify what this is, right? Advertisement, clearly. What are they advertising? Fertilizer. This was the first successful chemical fertilizer advertisement in China from the 1920s. It's called the Rich Farmer, Poor Farmer poster. Which guy is using the chemical fertilizer? The Fei-Tian-Fen, they call it back then. They didn't have a word for fertilizer back then. Now they call it Fei-Liao. But then they called it fertile field powder. And this was actually a company, Brunnermann later became ICI. Okay? So the first successful introduction. So obviously this is the guy using the chemical fertilizer. And then the second question, whenever you see an advertisement is, okay, false advertising, right? Wrong. This is correct. For the 1920s, the limitation of nitrogen in these areas was extremely high. Much higher than anything we're going to experience here, where we've only been farming the soil for 100 years. And we still got fossil organic matter in the soil in abundance. In these areas with thousands of years of cultivation, the native soil organic matter coming from those preceding ecosystems is almost not there. If you do the studies of the carbon-14, most of the organic matter in these soils is maintained by inputs. It's not coming from some fossil form in the past. So this actually did produce dramatic, 3 times yield increase. Easy to do back then with nitrogen. Now it's not sustainable to do that. But it is a fact. These were so nitrogen limiting that it was easy to improve yields that way. So if you look at traditional rice yields in this area, there's no evidence of a decline. There's some wavering around, but there's no evidence that rice yields declined in this area. This is the Tai Lake region of China. Famous is the land of fish and rice, an area of China that is really probably the most productive area of China, always has been, still is. Shanghai is on the next step, but of course Shanghai is a newcomer to the scene in this region. Anyway, you can see, if anything, when you get to this historical period where you can actually get some decent measurements, you've got about 4 tons of rice per hectare, sustainable over time. If you know anything about rice production, without any fertilizer at all, you get about 2.5 2,500 metric tons, or sorry, kilograms per hectare. Anyway, so there's your kind of traditional baseline. This is what they were able to sustain using their traditional systems of using green manures and other management systems. And you can see they've doubled that, at least. In fact, they're now typically at 10 tons regularly in this region. It's the highest yielding rice area probably in the world. Very high yielding. It's not necessarily a very big producer anymore because there's so many people living there. There's not that much cropland in production there. But they routinely get the highest yields in China in this region. clearly something happened here. It was mostly a mix, as it was here, of new varieties that could use the synthetic nitrogen, and synthetic nitrogen really gave this big boost to primary productivity. And I wanted to study that. I wanted to study how these people use these systems. And of course, the first thing I learned when I was working in these kind of environments is that you want to understand the ecology of the oldest ecosystems, of the most ancient human ecosystems, you have to talk to people. That's something you got to do all the time. Of course, something as we've heard, right? Dr. Devine's very good at that. He'll start up a conversation on any subject, anytime. So that was a helpful skill as well, to get out there and talk to people. This is actually some experimental plots we had in farmers' fields. Way back there, this was probably '94. And this is two varieties of rice. In the back, you actually see the traditional rice varieties. That long manacle there. You never see that today. And comparing different fertilizer levels and looking at the effect of chemical nitrogen fertilizer on traditional versus conventional varieties. And this is a reconstruction, again, from interviews, both historical interviews and modern day interviews, of different types of sources of nitrogen into the rice-wheat system. This is actually a rotation system, too. You can't really divorce one from the other. They always grow rice, and they used to always grow wheat or rapeseed. Now they actually don't grow the winter crop as much. But you can see the input difference is very striking. It's about a 5-fold difference in total nitrogen inputs. The other thing that's very striking is, where is the big change? The imported sources of nitrogen are the really big change. A fascinating thing, though, that I learned that I didn't really want to learn, I still don't really want to believe this. This was also one of the very few places in the world where traditional farmers would pay money to buy fertilizer. They didn't have chemical nitrogen. This is not chemical purchases. This is purchases of soybean bean cake. It's the residue from pressing soybean oil. It's purchasing human manure from the cities. It's different sources of purchased fertilizer. Again, it's such a return on investment for nitrogen that it was worth doing. The natural sources are twofold. The natural inputs are from the, you'll see the sediment fertilizer. They used a form of sediment harvesting from the wetlands. This is a very wet area. And the actual nitrogen fixation itself. It's both of those things put together. And the recycled nitrogen is from crop residues, which is an important part. So I was asking the question, how much can you get with nitrogen just by recycling it? One thing I found is that it was very hard to recycle nitrogen. There's very little evidence that that's a huge contribution. It's a lot of material moving around, but not much being conserved. It's hard to conserve it. It's always coming out. It's leaking. The other thing I learned, though, is that it doesn't, the average system, the system that's used by kind of the typical person, doesn't exist in these places. Every farmer is completely unique, okay? But it doesn't just have this kind of social meaning. It actually has an ecological meaning. You'll see it's actually a global ecological meaning. If you look at what happens to nitrogen when you add it to a cropping system, this again is the rice-wheat system put together. You can see as you add more fertilizer, you get an increase in yield up to a point where it saturates. And it says have an optimal function. So you should be applying about this much to get your maximum yield. In terms of the environmental impacts of that fertilizer, whether it goes into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide and causes problems with both the ozone layer and with global warming, or whether it goes into groundwater, either way, your nitrogen losses aren't so bad down here. They're significant, but they're not so bad. But after you get past this point, right, there's no incentive. There should be no incentive for a farmer to apply more than that amount. And your environmental harm is greater every increment you add, because the plants just can't take it up anymore. What do people actually do? You find approximately what you would think. The average person applies approximately the right amount, which is what you'd expect. People are not stupid. People are mostly trying to optimize their applications. But you find some people are down here, and some of these guys are the people that have jobs somewhere else. Right? They don't need the income from the crops. They can buy rice, and so they're not really caring so much about the crop. But what about over here? Why would anybody apply 900 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare? It's extreme. It's no possible way you can get a benefit agriculturally from this. Can you guess? It's the same reason as in the United States. Why do people apply too much? Who are the worst over-fertilizers in America? Lawns. What's that? Lawns, but no, think about it in terms of agriculture. People who have a lot of animals. You got to get it out of the barn. And that's the same situation with these guys. These guys are the big pig farmers. And it tells you something about how to clean up this problem as well. You don't want everybody to go to the average, or sorry, you don't want everyone just to go back. These guys shouldn't go back. You don't want to tell everyone, reduce your fertilizer applications. You want them to manage better, get people to this kind of optimal state. And you can do that if you know who the people that are over-applying are. In fact, what if you gave some of this to them? You could solve the problem with the same resources. So a big problem that we have. Anyway, so I went out there expecting to see tremendous nitrogen fertilizer pollution problems. That's what you'd expect, right? People applying such a huge amount. And this well is indeed polluted with nitrate. But the surprising thing was this was very rare. Actually, most wells were not polluted with nitrogen at all, which was extremely surprising with these high rates. And these wells are like 100 feet away. They're like right up next to the fields. The reason is it's a rice paddy. And it's always wet. It's got a thick plow pan that doesn't leach. And most of it goes up into the atmosphere. It's up in the atmosphere. All right, you hold on to that because we'll get into the global world of trouble in a minute. Okay, then we've got another problem, more local problem. And this is something, you can probably guess what this guy is doing. Maybe you don't know what's in the bucket though. What's in the bucket? It's farm soil. Night soil, that is correct. This is the traditional recycling of human manure. Okay, and again, that's another one of those recycled inputs. And very common in China traditionally. And notice where he's applying it. He's applying it to rice. And that's because there was a nitrogen limitation. And there was a big incentive to carry that heavy, stinky stuff all the way from your house, a quarter mile away, to dump it on the field. Okay, it's a lot of work, and nobody liked that kind of work. Okay, this is what they do now. This is really close to the house. Much easier. Just get it out of the barn, essentially, right? Get it out of your they don't have toilet systems in most of rural China. Anyway, so fertilizing the vegetables close to the house and over-fertilizing the heck out of them. When I found polluted wells, this was the cause. This and animal stalls, that was the main cause. It wasn't the actual chemical fertilizer. I call this the chemical fertilizer displacement syndrome. This fertility is still in the system. It's got to go somewhere. You bring in this cheap, light thing that you can just do all your extensive fertilizing with, and everyone's going to take the concentrated stuff and just throw it away, basically. And it's created most of that fertilizer pollution problem in the region. This is something else that disappeared. This is the traditional use of canal sediments. I mentioned this was a big source of nutrient in the past. Also, incredibly hard labor. You can't imagine. We did this a couple times to replicate it. It was unbelievable how much labor it takes to scoop canal sediment out and bring it onto land and use it as a fertilizer. And it's actually part of even a more complicated system that I won't describe, in which they composted this in a wet pit, a lined pit, with this green manure as a really a very efficient way to make an ammonium-rich manure fertilizer that's better for rice paddies. It's kind of an anoxic environment. But this is the result of that. Okay, these canals used to be deep like that, and you could take canals through there. You could go anywhere in this region on a canal. You could go to any house. That's what everyone told me. Now they're filling in, and of course they throw all their junk in there too. And it's really created a kind of an unpleasant environment. Again, another effect of bringing in the synthetic nitrogen. You could argue that was the reason. If they still needed this stuff, they'd still be taking it out. But let's get into the world thing. Why did I get, and I'll show you, by the end I'll be in the world of trouble, no longer here looking at the field. This is the way a quarter of the world's synthetic nitrogen is applied, by hand in China. Okay, it's not big, chemical moving tractors taking it around. That's a fair amount too. But in China, this is almost all the fertilizer in China is applied this way. Individual household decisions applied without any real strong technical background, just going after. These are not mostly professional farmers either. They're part-time farmers now, mostly in China. We also know that humans have essentially equaled the total amount of nitrogen fixed naturally with the amount we fixed using primarily the Haber process to make synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. We are now fixing about as much as nature is. And it's a variety of reasons, but the primary one is the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. Again, a quarter applied there. And I started thinking, here we have this incredible transition from no synthetic nitrogen, 100 kilograms per hectare, to 500 on average. You've got about 2 million square kilometers of land in this kind of category, densely populated agricultural landscapes, not these far out fields. These are places where people are living packed together. Okay? That area didn't change much. The population, though, increased pretty significantly. And it occurred to me that this is really global change. This is local processes, right? This is fine-scale local stuff, but it has global impacts. What are the global impacts?